What if the story of English ancestry is nothing like what you've been taught? Behind the myth of Anglo-Saxon purity lies a genetic truth so complex and controversial that historians spent centuries trying to bury it. In 1994, archaeologists excavating a medieval cemetery in York made a discovery that would shake British identity to its core. Among the bones of supposed Anglo-Saxon warriors, DNA analysis revealed something impossible. These individuals, buried with Germanic weapons and jewelry, carried genetic signatures from North Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. The findings were quietly archived, deemed too controversial for publication. But the question remained, if these weren't pure Anglo-Saxons, then who were the English people really? To understand English genetic origins, we must go back 11,000 years to the end of the last ice age. The first people to recolonize Britain were hunter-gatherers from continental Europe. DNA extracted from Cheddar Man, a skeleton found in Somerset dating to around 7,600 BC, shocked scientists in 2018. This ancient Briton had dark to black skin, blue eyes, and dark curly hair. Nothing like modern English people. These hunter-gatherers thrived until around 4000 BC, when the first farmers arrived from Anatolia, modern Turkey. These Neolithic people brought agriculture and built Stonehenge. Within 1,000 years, they had almost completely replaced the hunter-gatherer population through disease, superior numbers, and possibly violence. Then, around 2400 BC, came an invasion that rewrote British genetics entirely. The Beaker people swept into Britain from continental Europe. DNA studies published in 2018 by Harvard geneticist David Reich revealed something shocking. Within just a few centuries, the Beaker people replaced about 90% of Britain's population. The genetic signatures of the Neolithic farmers who built Stonehenge essentially vanished. This wasn't peaceful migration. It was population replacement on a massive scale. The Beaker people were descended from Yamnaya steppe herders who had conquered much of Europe. They brought bronze working, wheeled vehicles, and Indo-European languages. Archaeological sites show evidence of warfare, burned settlements, and mass graves. By 1000 BC, the descendants of the Beaker people had become what we call the Celts. Despite later English nationalist claims, Celtic peoples formed the primary ancestry of Britain for over 1,000 years. Modern genetic studies show that Celtic ancestry forms the largest component of English DNA, far more than Anglo-Saxon ancestry. The Celts spoke Celtic languages, created intricate metalwork, and built hill forts across the landscape. The Roman conquest beginning in 43 AD brought massive demographic changes that English nationalism has systematically downplayed. For nearly 400 years, Britain was part of the Roman Empire. Roman garrisons included soldiers from across the known world: Syrians, North Africans, Greeks, Spaniards, and Gauls. These soldiers settled, married local women, and had children. DNA analysis of Roman-era cemeteries in London and York reveals astonishing diversity. Skeletons show ancestry from the Middle East, North Africa, and Southern Europe. The Ivory Bangle Lady, a high-status woman buried in York around 300 AD, had sub-Saharan African ancestry. Her grave goods suggest she was wealthy and respected. This wasn't exceptional. It was typical of Roman Britain's cosmopolitan population. Modern English people carry genetic markers from Roman times: North African Y chromosome haplogroups, Middle Eastern mitochondrial DNA, and Southern European ancestry. Here's where English history becomes propaganda. Traditional narratives claim that after Rome withdrew in 410 AD, Germanic tribes invaded and replaced the Romano-British population. This Anglo-Saxon conquest supposedly created the English people. Generations of English school children learned this story as fact. Modern DNA analysis reveals it's largely fiction. A massive genetic study published in 2016 analyzed DNA from thousands of English people. The results were shocking. English people have only about 20 to 40% Anglo-Saxon ancestry. The majority, 60 to 80%, comes from earlier populations: Celts, Romans, and pre-Celtic inhabitants. What actually happened was far less dramatic. Anglo-Saxon migration did occur, but it was relatively small scale. Estimates suggest only 100,000 to 200,000 Germanic migrants entered Britain over several centuries, mixing with a Romano-British population of 2 to 3 million. The Anglo-Saxons became culturally dominant through political power, not numerical superiority. Beginning in 793 AD, Viking raids terrorized Britain's coasts. But raids became settlement. Modern DNA studies show that people in northern and eastern England carry significant Scandinavian ancestry, often 20 to 30%. Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and East Anglia show the highest Scandinavian influence. Some English villages have genetic profiles closer to modern Norwegians than to southern English people. The Norman invasion of 1066 brought another wave of genetic mixing. The Normans were descendants of Vikings who had settled in northern France. When William the Conqueror defeated Harold at Hastings, he brought thousands of Norman soldiers and settlers. These Normans married into English families, and their descendants spread Norman genetic markers across England. DNA testing reveals that many supposedly pure English families have as much French ancestry as Germanic. Medieval England saw continuous immigration that further diversified the gene pool. Jewish communities established themselves in London from the 11th century until their expulsion in 1290. Many converted to Christianity and remained, their descendants carrying Middle Eastern genetic markers. Flemish weavers migrated in the 14th century. French Huguenots fled religious persecution in the 16th and 17th centuries. Their descendants form a substantial portion of middle-class English ancestry. The British Empire's global reach created genetic connections that English nationalism prefers to ignore. Sailors, soldiers, and merchants traveled to Asia, Africa, and the Americas, often having children with local women. DNA testing increasingly reveals hidden South Asian, African, and Caribbean ancestry in supposedly pure English families. The East India Company employed thousands of English men in India. Many had relationships with Indian women. Their mixed-race children sometimes returned to England and passed as white. The 19th century saw the rise of racial science that desperately tried to classify human populations. Victorian scientists promoted the idea of the English as a pure Anglo-Saxon race. This pseudoscience served political purposes, justifying empire and class divisions. But even as Victorian scientists promoted Anglo-Saxon purity, their own DNA would have revealed the mixture they denied. Contemporary genetic studies have demolished the myth of English ethnic homogeneity. The average English person's ancestry breaks down roughly as follows: 37% Celtic, 35% Anglo-Saxon, 15% Scandinavian, 7% Norman French, and 6% from other sources including Roman, Jewish, and recent immigrants. But individual results vary wildly. Some English people have 60% Celtic ancestry. Others show 50% Scandinavian heritage. There is no single English genetic profile. The dark secret of English genetic origins isn't that the English are mixed. It's that the entire concept of a pure English ethnicity is a modern political invention with no basis in biological reality. English people are a genetic mixture of at least 10 major population groups spanning 4,000 years. What makes someone English isn't their DNA. It's language, culture, and identity. Genetics shows that Englishness was never about blood purity, but about cultural assimilation. Modern nationalism relies on myths of ethnic purity to create division. But science reveals these myths as lies. The English people, like all populations, are products of migration, conquest, and mixture. Understanding this genetic truth doesn't diminish English identity, it enriches it.